Mark, thanks so much for joining me on the Mark Divine Show. It's really great to see you and to meet you, and I appreciate you doing this.
Thanks a lot, Mark. It's a real honor to get to be on the show.
Yeah. Well, we got a lot to talk about with your work with post-traumatic stress and recovery in law enforcement, and also in just this horrible issue of suicide, which both you and I are dealing with or have dealt with, and I'm dealing with it in the SEAL community. But before we get into that stuff, just give us a little bit about your background. You grew up in Canada. What was your childhood like? What were some of the influences in your life? What led you into law enforcement? Who's Mark?
Sure, I'd love to jump into that. I had a great upbringing, loving family. My parents are still together after 50 plus years. I was very into sports. And for me, sports meant hockey because I'm in Canada. So played junior hockey, played a little bit of college, played a year in the Danish Elite League.
Did
And
you?
then the opportunity to join policing came up. And my passion really went from wanting to be a hockey player, which, I'm 5'10" and was never really going to work out for me, to helping people through policing. And I've really learned to develop a passion for that. And now I've
Yeah.
taken my experiences within policing and I'm trying to help change a bit of the culture, to prepare people for the some of the challenges we face. Because I think we're doing a pretty good job of facing the danger and the physical challenges, probably kind of like what you guys have experienced in the SEALs. But I think we still have some work to do in preparing for the psychological challenges.
Sure.
And personally, I experienced some. So that's why I'm trying to share that to help reduce the stigma and to help other people prepare for it.
What is policing like up in Canada? I mean, I have a general sense for what it's like in the States, and it's pretty different, I think. What's the attitude? What's the training like? What's your mission focus?
Yeah, there's definitely overlap. At the end of the day, policing is about helping people. Like the primary purpose of policing
I
is,
wonder if most cops in the United States would think that's their primary mission. The public probably certainly doesn't perceive that.
yeah. And to be honest, like when I just finished my master's in leadership recently, and I actually was able to do some self-directed studies. And one of them, my main focus was studying police culture and the impacts on police officer mental health.
Right?
And I've sat in on lots of recruiting interviews for new cops. And you know what everybody says? They walk in the door, why do you want to be a cop? I want to help people. Unfortunately, often in the job, you don't feel like you're helping people because you're dealing with so much of societal problems and you feel helpless. You go to the same call, the same house, with the same people, with the same problems.
Right.
And we're just going around putting out fires and we can't really deal with it. And a lot of times society doesn't understand police tactics and police psychology, but even like police use of force is a big topic, and especially use of lethal force. But what they don't understand is often we are forced to use lethal force to save innocent people. Like there's
Right.
actually a safety priorities, or it used to be called priorities of life. And hostages and innocent civilians are above police. So often people think, oh, the cop shot them because they don't know how to de-escalate and because of their, you know, confirmation bias and all these other things. And what they don't actually know is the psychological impacts on those officers. If you read
Right.
a book like Shots Fired by Chuck Ryland, multiple of these officers, he chronicles about maybe 10 or 12 officers after their shootings, and multiple end up suicidal
Really?
afterward. And that's not, personally, I have talked to numerous officers who have had suicidal thoughts. And we're not educated about this. We're not truly prepared for it. But when you look at the research, there's a great study up here in Canada that showed about 10% of members of the RCMP, which is our national police force, which I'm a part of, will have suicidal thoughts in a year. And
Yeah.
about 25% will have that in their lifetime. But here we prepare them for the physical dangers, but we don't actually tell them that it's the psychological injuries that have been killing more police officers for all these years. And
Right.
then it's amplified because the public doesn't understand. So now again, I've spent 10 years on what we call an emergency response team, which is the same as a SWAT team. That's what
Hmm.
we are up here. So I obviously know a lot of officers who've been through, officer involved shootings. And for some of them, it can be, such a severe traumatic experience that really deeply impacts them. But often the public doesn't understand. We're just going out to try and keep people safe. And
Right.
unfortunately, the subject or suspect makes decisions and takes actions that we don't get to control. And we
So let
have
me
to
just
often take action to keep people safe.
right. So let me just pause and just kind of simplify what you're saying. So what you're saying is, the training that you go through, right, really is the use of force, the escalation continuum of force, the SWAT text and all that. And then what happens in reality is you get into a situation, and the situation ends up calling, rightly or wrongly, or by judgment, for deadly force, use of deadly force against a civilian. And in the aftermath, what you're saying is, well, 25%, first 10%, but over the career, 25% of officers don't have the psychological skills to process the killing of a civilian in the line of duty. And that leads to suicidal ideation. Is that what you're saying?
Sort of. I just want to be clear. It's not necessarily because of that. So many officers who will experience suicidal thoughts will not have experienced officer involved shootings. It
Really?
is only a small percentage of officers who will experience that. And even some of the officers who've experienced officer involved shootings, some of what impacts them is unrelated. It's the kind of emotional pain that we go to from intense suffering. We go to next of kin notifications. We do, sex assault, child files where horrible things happen to very innocent people.
I see.
And essentially, we can carry a piece of that emotional pain.
I
And I
see.
know as a new cop, I didn't understand that. I would go to something terribly devastating, traumatic, and I thought I should just be able to take my police hat off, walk out the door like nothing
Yeah,
happened.
like
And
nothing
I
happened.
didn't know why for years I carried that emotional pain around.
Yeah.
And it really helped me to change my mental model that, hey, like I'm a person first and a cop second. And I know like part of what I learned is actually your term of background of obviousness, which really essentially is mental models. And I
Right.
had to challenge the mental models that weren't helping me. And that was a big thing for me to be able to let go of. Like, it's not weakness to have emotions. We're people. We're meant to have emotions. And if the day comes that we can go see terrible things and it never impacts us in any way, like that might be a sign that, you're like basically you're a dad who can't go home and tell your kids you love them because you're turning off your emotions.
Right. Yeah. What do you think the role TBI might be playing in all of this? And I just want to, traumatic brain injury, we used to think really was a result of like a serious blunt trauma type incident. But now we know can come from just simply like firearms training or ballistics explosions from like just basically being at the range and practicing how to blow something up with det cord or with explosives. And so law enforcement and police, not police, but military are constantly shooting and blowing shit up. And so they're getting this micro TBI, and over the course of time, this TBI that is unaddressed uh, can have a really profound impact on one's psychology, right? Leading to just distortions in thinking, right? Anxiety and depression and just distorted thinking. So then you throw on top of that the post traumatic stress of the unresolved emotional trauma, and you've got a really unfortunate, powerful cocktail there. Has that been addressed or studied at all in the Canadian police situation?
Wow, it's a great point. We're actually doing some pretty awesome work with some studies. They're doing a study here up in our national police force where they have different biometric tracking and they're going to follow like a longitudinal study over years around PTSD. I don't know the specifics well enough to comment on that part, but I think you're onto something. So personally, back to my hockey career, I experienced a lot of concussions. And then when I went to work as a cop and then experienced trauma, I think those actually made it worse. So I
Right.
eventually had to go see a naturopath, and we did like blood tests, and they found my the good hormones, like your testosterone growth hormone, were a tiny fraction of what they should be, and
Mm,
my cortisol, like some of my stress hormones, were highly elevated.
right.
And then they were able to, you know, say, hey, this is what's going on. Like you look in the mirror and you don't look different, but there's changes happening on a chemical hormonal level that you can't see. And so you're totally right. Like trauma even can change your brain, like how the shape of your brain, let alone the explosions. And now we start talking about healthy, positive things to help with it and hurtful things. What we're often taught is cope through alcohol, right? That's within police culture. And I think it's historically been within the military culture as
Right.
well, which is the most detrimental thing you can do. And
Right.
really what number one protective factor is actually probably your sleep, which
Right.
now we throw you into shift work, totally dysregulate your physiology. Like I currently work 2 days, 2 nights. You can't design a worse schedule than that. But
Yeah.
so we wonder why people can't let their brain heal. Like,
Yeah.
sleep
I
is our
actually did
natural medicine, which again, I learned so much from you from Dr. Parsley. Like that was my intro to understanding why my hormones were all messed up was because I wasn't sleeping and all I was doing was drinking. And that you can't, you couldn't design a worse system for people to actually heal
right.
than, go drink and don't sleep and see what happens. It's not going to be good.
It's part of my doctoral program. I did a just for one statistics class, a short study on a data set that was taken by USC on shift workers in an emergency room or a high intensity hospital environment, which is not dissimilar than a first responder. And what I found was that night shift workers actually had a statistically significant decline in optimism about their future. And it makes sense, right? But to see that statistically self-reported, that people who work at night or night shifts or odd shifts actually feel less optimistic. I mean, and which is a sign of resilience and also just long-term happiness. Like, wow, you would think that you got to do things to mitigate that, because that stuff builds up over time, and if your optimism is just being bled off at one point, I mean, that's really what suicide is all about, right? Is you just see no way out. You see no future for yourself.
Yeah. Let me
Optimism,
jump in for one sec.
right?
Mark, sorry if I'm cutting you off, but it's such an important point because there's actually research. Dr. John Violanti, he's one of the top academics, retired cop on this topic. He writes a book called Police Suicide Epidemic in Blue. And he's done all kinds of studies. And in one of those, basically there's like a direct correlation in this study of night shifts and suicide. So like your rate or your risk of suicide goes up the more night shifts you work, regardless of other factors. So I think those are like indirectly kind of measuring similar things of the
Right.
detrimental impacts because we're not designed to be up all night twice a week and there's a cost. But again, from learning sleep science, we can mitigate some of it. And I know for me, I experienced a lot of nightmares in my version of PTSD, and I had to change a lot about my habits. I had to quit drinking. I had to focus on sleep hygiene. And I had to slowly control what I could control to try and get better
Right.
to reduce the impacts that it was having on me.
Yeah. So let's say someone is a law enforcement or military guy listening to this, and they're like, you know what, I got to get this under control, and the VA is not helping me. Like, what do you say is like the most important thing? Like the start here, most important thing. Is it sleep? Is it exercise? Is it quitting drinking? Let's walk us through some sort of you know, not methodology, but a path back to recovery. Because you've walked that path.
Yeah. The number one thing I write, I have basically the way my book is set up is I have chapters on all these different topics. One
Right.
of those topics is trauma and essentially finding post traumatic growth. The number one tool that I write on that is take action. Because what happened when I was diagnosed with PTSD, I became a victim to that diagnosis. I
Yeah.
went from feeling like I could do anything that I was not capable of doing anything. And
Right.
I really carried a mental health stigma, which even as I finally got help and it started to get better, but it's so hard to do that. And there's studies where basically there's like a placebo effect. So even if people take part in a study and all they do is take a sugar pill that should have no impact, you actually see measurable improvements from
Right.
just taking action. And
Right.
the reality is, everyone is different. Their versions of the impact of trauma, whether it's PTSD, depression, anxiety, they'll be impacted in different ways and different treatments can help them. And sometimes it's formal treatments through a psychologist. It's things like EMDR or psychedelics or CBT or all the, like, there's lots of formal treatments. But for example, for me, one of my most powerful treatments was actually journaling, which
Right.
again is something you talk about. And I never would have done it, except I looked up to one of my mentors on our ERT team or our SWAT team, and he told me how it helped him. And he said, just send me an email. He's like, write it up. Just tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what's going on. He's like, you don't even need to hit send. The value is in the typing. And I
Right.
actually sent it to him. And we ended up communicating back and forth for a couple months around the time I went on stress leave. And I still have those emails. So what I've done is I've actually shared parts of that in the book where I explain what it's like, what it was like for me in my most hardest moments. I explain what it's like to have night terrors, to have anxiety attacks, to have rage you can't control. But then it also kind of follows me on a bit of my journey of healing, of saying how much journaling helped me, how much learning about sleep science, which back then I was learning it from Dr. Parsley, which I heard from you. So
Right.
that it's kind of cool to see back in these journal emails of how stuff like that got better. And actually one of them was stopping drinking, which
Right.
was huge. I in my journal I wrote, hey, I haven't had a drink in 2 days and I haven't slept better these 2 days. Like I haven't slept that well in months.
That's awesome.
But it was also so hard to do. Like I woke up one morning, it's 9 in the morning, and I went, I need to quit drinking. And I actually said to myself, I can't. And I'm normally a non-drinker who was drinking like crazy. And I had to set a micro goal, which again, I attribute to learning about stuff that people do to get through Hell Week and get through as Navy SEALs. My
Yeah.
micro goal became 1 hour. I went, well, I don't usually drink till nighttime because that's when the nightmares come. I'm like, I can go 1 hour. I'm like, okay, cool. Go 1 hour and then set a new goal. And eventually that turned into a day. And I celebrated. I put a little whiteboard on my fridge. I didn't drink yesterday. I won't drink tomorrow. And that built into a week, that built into a month. And you just take those little micro goals, whatever you can do, you put that one step in front. Was just huge for me to start healing and start moving forward.
Yeah. That's great. And I love that description of how do you change a habit that's destructive, right? To do it in small chunks and to track it and to set, little tiny goals. That's great. And I agree with you. Alcohol really is, it masks over the pain temporarily, but it also, in doing so, you don't really get to look at the pain. You don't get to look at the trauma. And so that's the point of therapy, which journaling is self therapy, right? Because you're objectifying, you're taking that trauma, you're acknowledging it, and then you're taking it out of yourself and putting it on a piece of paper, and you're sharing it, at least with a piece of paper or with the universe, or like in your case with a friend, which is like sharing it with a therapist. But if you're just drinking, you're basically pushing that stuff down, and you're not taking a look at it. But then, you're also screwing up your sleep, because one thing that really messes up your sleep is alcohol, right? And also just eating junk before bedtime. And so usually those go hand in hand too, right? You have a couple drinks, you might have some junk food, or you get hungry, right? And then all of a sudden you're going to bed, and all that sugar is spiking your cortisol and just wrecking your sleep cycle. And you do this day over day, and you never make that sleep up. Like you learned from Parsley, right? You go into sleep deficit, and then all of a sudden all of your hormones get out of balance, and everything starts to go south, right? Your anxiety goes up, stress levels go up, then it exacerbates all of the problems. So these are like, all these things are interconnected. Like there's no one thing, right, that is a panacea, right? You have to really kind of look at this as an integrated kind of physical, mental, emotional, and even spiritual healing process, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So for me, like most people, when they write a book, often it's more of like a memoir, autobiography, and they just tell their story. What
Right.
I tried to do um, was write each chapter on topics that I know I needed to learn about that
Mm.
impacted me. So, like, chapter 2 is mental health stigma. Chapter 3 is lethal force psychology. Um, chapter 4 is emotional pain, and just like how to change your mental models around those. Trauma, even suicide, which for me, like I wrote about it because of my experience of the suicide of a loved one. Like, and I was the last person to talk to him. And actually, chapter 8's intuition and understanding brain science. Because I remember that day, he was my godfather, Bill, and I lived in a basement suite in his house. And he came down to speak to me, and we can tell something's wrong. Like just looking at someone, the way they speak, they're not themselves. And I remember the moment he walked away, and I thought, man, Bill didn't seem like himself. I should
Right.
talk to him next time I see him. And I never got the chance. And, it breaks my heart. I wish I had, but I
Right.
can't go back and change that. And I carried a lot of guilt and shame
Right.
for that, for people sort out their affairs ahead of time. So Bill actually came and brought me this book, some book he'd never told me about. again, he wasn't himself, just it's really important you have this. And I didn't understand it, what was happening at the time. But when I look back after the fact, I could see, oh, that's what it was. I just didn't know it then. And since then, I've had that hard conversation with numerous people when I worry about them and you see they're not themselves and there's signs.
Right.
And I've asked them, hey, are you thinking of killing yourself? And it's a horrible question to have to ask, and it's really hard, but it's important to ask. And I have had people talk about thoughts of suicide and, making sure we get them help. And part of it is to talk about it, to normalize it. As I said with these stats earlier, and I'm sure it's similar with the military, that basically, in my opinion, it's often you're just overwhelmed with pain in a temporary time frame, and that, like you mentioned tunnel vision, but people's vision constricts and they
Right.
see that as their way out. And I, again, in studying this stuff, there's actually some really important research that's happened, and there's psychologists who've really studied this stuff. But to me, it's the kind of stuff I think we need to share, in police training and military training. We need to prepare people for the other dangers that often is what gets them, and what they aren't prepared for, because I think we can change the outcomes if we
Yeah.
if we start educating people better on these type of topics. I think we can change it in policing, which is, again, my main push. But I think once we do that, we can change it like, so there's so much overlap in the other professions, whether you're a doctor, a firefighter, a nurse, a paramedic, a cop, in the military. Like, we deal with a lot of very similar challenges of, we're asked to do near impossible things, and we're
Right.
asked, to not have it impact us. Whereas I think in a different way, sometimes it's going to impact us, but let's teach healthy coping strategies. So instead of
Yeah.
passing on, through our culture, that the next generation, oh, just here's a bottle, go get drunk and hope good luck. Well, let's pass on journaling, or let's pass on talking to a psychologist. Let's normalize some of the experience, so that we understand, you don't, like, in my opinion, I know it's technically still called post-traumatic stress disorder, but I see my experience as a psychological injury, and one that
Yeah.
I've largely healed from.
I
And I
agree with
think
that.
if
In
we
fact, I
teach,
think the whole idea of post-traumatic stress is, it again, it's just a name, and when you name something, then you think, oh, you understand it, but you don't. And what I think one of the challenges with the idea of post-traumatic stress is a lot of the stress is like of piled on to original trauma, like childhood trauma. And I've had this discussion with a few Navy SEALs, and we're in agreement, although there's very little research, if any, on it, is that post-traumatic stress really is just it's the childhood trauma that was unresolved that gets triggered and then layered on with the trauma of the military experience or the law enforcement experience. So just knowing that, like, and knowing that you're going into a field that's going to layer on some significant trauma, like, wouldn't it be nice if the training had and the organizations had the sophistication to help the individuals deal with unresolved trauma before or as they're serving, and then also to deal with the trauma in real time immediately after an incident, right? So, like, that's why in the military they now are starting to staff psychologists. But the point is, like, when I was in Iraq, I would come home after an op and I would do box breathing and I would visualize myself healthy and achieving my future goals. I would do the unbeatable mind practice that were in the early stages of development. But my peers who were the younger, hard chargers in the platoons would come back from an op and they would decompress by getting on like first person shooter games, which is horrible because what it's just no different than drinking. And they probably would have drank if they had alcohol in Iraq, but they didn't. So they
yeah.
were masking over the trauma and they were suppressing all those emotions. And years later, these guys are now committing suicide, which is horrible.
Yeah, I think what you described in video games can be one of the choices people make for basically escapism. Like,
Right.
it's our way to manage it, whether it's alcohol or numbing. Some people it's shopping, it's gambling, it's sex, it's cheating, there's all kinds of unhealthy coping strategies, but it's people just, we're not really taught how to deal with it. And I think, like what you've expressed, as some of our senior people have found healthier ways, it's on us to pass that on to the next generation, to
Right.
show them the healthier ways of hey, these are real challenges. Just like we teach them how to overcome the challenges of actually physically being safe,
Yeah.
let's show them the challenges of how to overcome some of the psychological challenges. And
Right.
back to what you said about suicide, I think there's such important lessons around that. So for me and what I wrote in my chapter, I learned one of those lessons from someone named Kevin Hines. And Kevin Hines is a very well-known suicide prevention advocate. Kevin tried to die from a suicide and he jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge,
Jeez.
was severely injured, broke his vertebrae in his back. And what he thought he wanted to die, he was overwhelmed with pain. And what he learned after leaving the railing before even hitting the water is he wanted nothing more than to live.
Wow.
Because basically people learn that wisdom from that hardship. And now he goes around telling that story and sharing that with people that, hey, you don't actually want to die. It's just you're overwhelmed with pain, and there's a different way of resolving that pain. Instead of choosing suicide and spreading it to everyone else, you can redirect your courage, the same courage you use to confront the physical pain and danger, towards that emotional pain.
Yeah.
And that's such an important lesson. And I don't know if you know who Dakota Meyer is. I'm going to guess you probably do. He was a Medal of Honor recipient, um, who's spoken about his demons after he came back. And he actually also tried to die from a suicide. He tells the story. He pulled over one day in his truck, took out his gun, put it to his head, pulled the trigger, but it didn't go off.
Oh, wow.
And then he checked. Someone had unloaded his gun. Once again, because of intuition, people could see he probably wasn't doing well. They're worried about him. And all they did was unload his gun. Just
Wow.
like Kevin, immediately after trying, he realized, I don't want to die. Both
Wow.
Kevin Hines and Dakota Meyer are still alive today. And I tell those two stories in my book because what I want to spread is that wisdom they learned the hard way. And all Dakota would have had to do is rack around and he wouldn't be here anymore. But here he is years later as an advocate about suicide prevention and mental health. And I want like cops and again, people in the military, whatever profession, to hear those kind of stories ahead of time. That's part of what someone like Dr. Violanti calls for in his book, Police Suicide Epidemic in Blue. It's what some of the surviving family members of police suicides call for is more education, training, prevention on this stuff ahead of time so that when officers do run into the emotional pain and overwhelmed, that they at least like have some level of logic of understanding of
Yeah, there
recognition
should be
of a
like
pattern.
a red button. Before you do it, before you do the final act, press this, right? Right.
Yeah.
And
So hopefully we can learn that wisdom from them without needing to experience that level because like for police suicides, like 90+% are by firearm, which is the most lethal method. And police officers have, again, from Dr. Violanti's stats, a 54% higher rate of suicide than the general public. And in theory, they should be lower. We're passing psychological tests, we're employed, like we're healthy, fit people when we join, and then we're just thrown into so much challenge. And I think there's a comparable for you guys in the military. We hire amazing people who go do almost near impossible things, but then we just aren't yet, or we can still do better to prepare them and support them through that at the end, or after they do those hard things. And yeah, that's a future that I really believe we
yeah.
can do.
Well, and I think, there's two things in my head right now. One is, one of the things that causes people not to ask for help and to take the final act is shame, right? So they're experiencing all this shame, which is from childhood trauma. And it's just it's so exacerbated and so painful that, that they're ashamed of their actions. They're ashamed that they're not healthy. They're ashamed that they're thinking poorly. They're ashamed even that they're thinking about suicide, and they're too ashamed to pick up the phone and tell people about their shame. And so, how do we got to destigmatize that and let people know, hey, this is okay, right? It's okay to feel shame. That's normal, actually. And it's worse, actually, if you pull the trigger, because now you're leaving that stain on your family, and you're throwing everything into turmoil, and now you've got generational guilt, right? To deal with
Yeah.
your action of suicide, which is just basic on shame. So, I was thinking about this with my friend Mark Crampton, who is just a beloved friend of ours, one of our SEAL Fit coaches, retired Force Master Chief, ran the instructor training as a civilian at Buds. I mean, this guy was like AJ squared away. there was not a thing in his behavior that would indicate that he was having suicidal thoughts. Not one, not even to his wife and kids. And then just one day he just goes and shoots himself. And we're like, what? How? Right? How? And it's because of this idea of shame. Like something was going on in him, probably both PTS and traumatic brain injury, where he was ashamed of his future. He was ashamed of himself, and he was too ashamed to ask for help. Anyway, so I don't know if there's a question there. It's more of a
Well, let
statement.
me let me touch on what you said, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
because shame is such a key part of this, and
yeah,
that's what's been found by some of the researchers. I know I've said him a few times, but guys like Dr. Violanti. There's another researcher I quote in my book, and sorry, her name's eluding me right now, but her research was all around suicide notes, and that's again a very key finding because shame isolates us, and
right.
isolation is a key part of what's happening. There's another researcher, Dr. Joyner. He proposes a model where he describes essentially our fearlessness or our ability to overcome our fear. Like what, as cops and as military, we overcome the fear of pain and danger and death, and that actually allows us to overcome our fear of death and of suicide, which is a risk factor for us. But he also proposes two other things. One part is a perceived burdensomeness. So that's where like my family would be better off without me. That type
Yeah,
of mindset, which is
I think
also
that right. What you just said is where Mark was. Mark, not you, not me, Mark, but Mark Crampton is thinking that the family would be better off without him because of some boogeyman in the future, like some potential degradation of his mental faculties. I've heard many military, and it's probably the same in law enforcement, say, and this is a dangerous thought, I would rather go out doing what I do as a warrior than being some decrepit old man, where someone has to change my diapers, right? So that type of thinking can lead you into this place where when suddenly you turn 60 years old and your hormones are out of whack and you're not thinking and your memory starts to go and you're thinking, uh-oh, here it is, right? Here it is. I'm going into the slow decline, I'm getting Alzheimer's or whatever. I'm just going to go out as a warrior. That's really bad thinking.
yeah. And at that point, too, we're often lacking one of the protective factors, which is the connection, which our team, like for me, I feel a tremendous sense of purpose and belonging where every day I wake up excited. How can I get a little bit better? Because I know I'm going to have to go do some hard things and I need to make myself better so my teammates can count on me.
Right.
And as guys leave the team, as I've watched guys leave our ERT program, most of them go through a depression because like you got to go do amazing things with your best friends every day and now it's gone. Like so
Right.
that's really hard. And for people who now are experiencing symptoms of trauma and all that and they've lost both the connection and the purpose and
Right.
meaning, you basically have to find a new one. And
That's
for
right.
me, like when I signed up for my master's degree, I timed it till when I left ERT at one point. I timed out. We had a term limits in my old department. And I knew I had to leave and I knew I needed a new goal, a new focus. You're not meant to just,
Yeah,
wander through life.
yeah,
And it
yeah,
really helped me because nothing's going to replace what I had. So rather than, being off at the range or some of the stuff we would do, okay, I'm going to sit and read books and study and just challenge myself in a different way, which again
right.
was really positive for me. But
Yeah,
I do want to go back to one thing. I was mentioning Dr. Joyner's model, and you really hit on the perceived burdensomeness, which again has been seen, and some of the examples I have looked at have been really apparent in things like suicide notes people have left. But there's another one, which is essentially isolation. That's the second part, where that's what happens. And again, that's strongly connected to shame because as we feel this shame, we naturally have this tendency to withdraw.
right.
And reducing stigma, talking about this stuff is what we can do. Like, and to me, it's moving from an intervention based model where we hope at the last second that someone's going to call the suicide crisis line. Like, it's good to have that. We need intervention. And I'm not saying we should get rid of it. But to me, let's take those resources and put them into prevention and education because
Right.
that's what people have been calling for. And when I look at some of the books around like the survivors of suicide, the families, that's part of what they're saying is like, where were these resources when this person was struggling? Where were
Right.
these resources before? And one of these officers, there's a book by Sarah Routier, and she's a survivor of suicide. Her husband, Sylvain Routier, was a SWAT cop up in Canada, and he died from a suicide. And that's essentially what she calls for is like, Sylvan probably had thousands of hours of training, but it's all about how to have a slightly faster draw or how to do these tactical things and be safe from the physical dangers. But if we could just shift a small portion of that to preparing you for the psychological
Yeah.
impacts, we could have such better outcomes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm hoping we're moving that direction. Of course, conversations like this and the work of our Courage Foundation, are helping. And there's other lots of veteran service organizations that are helping. But the units themselves, they need to get involved and provide that psychological support and training. I agree with that. Well, I have a question. Get your perspective on this. Since my friend Mark committed suicide last year around this time being April-ish, we've had like 5 or 6 other Navy SEALs commit suicide. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that, especially when a suicide is from a prominent and respected individual, that it could almost like pave the way for other people around the fence and be like, oh, if Mark can do it, then I can do it. Or if someone like Mark can't handle it, then how could I possibly handle it? And so, like a sympathetic detonation, I think a suicide can lead to others, and I'm sure there's some research around this, to others, or committing the act when they may not have done it had that person not have done it.
Yeah, you're right. I forget the name of the researcher, but one of the topics in my suicide chapter is contagion in clusters, and
Yes.
there is research around that. Um, Actually, back to Dr. Joyner, he shows that 2 of the days with the lowest suicide rates were around when people really connected. One of them was 9/11, and another one was the Miracle on Ice. So one is for a positive and one was essentially for a negative, but it's people coming together. But we
Okay.
have seen in the policing community times of suicide contagion and clusters where one happens, and then what we need is like the term I think used academically is like a postvention protocol of
Right.
what to do, how to respond if and when it does happen, so that we minimize that. Because I think what can happen is that person is loved, and then in a way they are praised for the good that they did and were as a person, and then others can choose to emulate that. But back to you mentioned so many suicides in the SEALs, and first off, I'm so sorry for your loss and to hear that. That's terrible. But I do believe we can have cultural change. So I'll give you one example, but I know things more within the policing community, but LAPD is an example. Tried to make suicide prevention a focus for them. So in about a decade, they had I think it was 37 um, suicides in comparison to 17 line of duty deaths, and then
Wow.
they rolled out a no suicide training program. And as part of that, they made cultural change part of the initiative. They actually did like a suicide prevention walk, where this became something talked about, and where people actually were just like a stigma reduction. And what they found for over 2 years, they did not have a suicide. So you
Wow.
went from averaging 3 suicides a year within that department to not having any. So essentially, you could argue statistically that 6 lives were saved, and that takes courage, but that also takes like leadership. And to
Right.
me, I think sometimes, in my opinion, our leaders are a bit disconnected from the realities of the profession. I know actually in your last book you referenced Team of Teams as a book, and
Yeah.
I actually think it's an awesome book. But it really can show how like sometimes what happens at that ground level, the ground truth, is so disconnected from the people
Yes.
at the top who kind of have the power and make decisions.
I think, yeah, you're right. And we're experiencing that in multiple domains, especially in the United States, because our bureaucracies have just gotten so bloated, and the people who kind of ascend to the top of these things aren't necessarily the most emotionally mature or caring people, right? It's the Peter principle. And gosh, I mean, it just seems like a real mess. And so we got to, what you're doing and what I advocate is a ground up approach, right? The operators got to take care of the operators. Families have to take care of the families, right? It has to be a community based approach, because you can't expect. I know they did it in LA, but with that success, you would think that it would ripple across all police agencies in the United States and Canada, but it's not. It's almost like everyone's in their own little silo and bubble, and they have to experience the pain, or have a leader like you come in order for any change to happen. So it's kind of like
Culture
the military changes at SEAL training happen because buds instructors make it happen. right? And it's not, unless it's like a death, and then suddenly they add more rules or something. But really, the evolution of improving the training usually happens from the ground up, like guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, you're right. And that, to me, I actually tried to advocate for some of these changes, both within my old organization and my new one, and I wasn't able to make it happen. And my answer is, what can I change? What can I control? And I said, I'm going to do my best to write the book I needed as a new cop, which sharing the lessons I needed. And
Yeah,
I don't think this is unique to policing. I think most of this is very true for military and so many other professions. And I
right.
really do believe in a better future for all of us when we can get there. But you kind of asked, like, why hasn't culture changed? Culture changes so slowly. That's just the reality. But when it changes because the experienced officers pass it on to the new people. And through my master's, we studied a bit of organizational culture and some of the work of Edgar Schein, which is
Yeah.
really impactful. And that to me was like, this is why I want to go on this podcast to speak about it. I never really wanted to write a book. I wanted to share what I learned the hard way to help other people. I'm lucky that I got some of this informally from some other awesome leaders who helped me. And I just want to pay it forward and try and help more people in the future. And I really believe we're going to get there in the next 20 years. We're going to be in a much better place. But let's not make it 20. Let's make it 2. Let's make it 2 months. Like, let's just keep taking steps to accelerate that positive change.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So your book is Setting My Sights on Stigma. Congratulations. I know it's a hard road to pour your heart and soul into a work like that. So well done.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll do whatever we can to support the cause. Both through Courage Foundation, which helps vets heal, and we're actually going to move into also law enforcement, not just vets, and also through sharing this information through the podcast and others. So thanks very much for doing what you're doing. And thanks for joining me today, Mark.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Mark. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, you as well. Booyah.